I always loved hiking. There's something about being surrounded by nature that made me feel free. I'd been on dozens of trails over the years, ranging from easy paths in local parks to challenging routes up mountains. But there's one hike that stands out in my memory for all the wrong reasons. To this day, I still replay every step of that journey, wondering if I could have done something differently. It was late September, the perfect time to hike in Vermont. The air was cool but not too cold, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I'd taken a Friday off from work to drive up to a trail I'd been meaning to try for years. It wasn't a well-known spot, which is exactly what drew me to it. I wanted solitude, a break from the noise of everyday life. The trail was in a forested area about an hour from my apartment. The drive there was uneventful, though the last stretch of road was little more than a dirt path. My car bumped and jolted over rocks and potholes, and I remember thinking I'd need to get my suspension checked when I got back. When I arrived, the parking area was empty. It wasn't much of a parking lot, just a clearing with room for a few cars. There was a wooden sign marking the start of the trail, but it looked weathered and forgotten. The words were faded, and one of the corners was broken off. Still, it was enough to confirm I was in the right place. I packed my backpack carefully. Water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone. I downloaded an offline map of the trail just in case, though I doubted I'd need it. The trail was supposed to be a simple loop, about 8 miles in total. It should have taken me 4 or 5 hours to complete. The first hour was perfect. The trail was well-worn but not overly maintained, which I liked. Felt natural, untouched. The trees formed a canopy overhead, and the sunlight filtered through in patches, creating a dappled pattern on the ground. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of birds. As I walked, I noticed small details that made the forest feel alive. A squirrel darted across the path, its tiny paws kicking up dirt. Mushrooms grew in clusters at the base of trees, their caps ranging from bright orange to deep brown. A stream ran parallel to the trail for a while, its water clear and cold. I stopped to fill my water bottle and splashed some on my face. It was refreshing, the kind of cold that wakes you up completely. But as the second hour passed, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small things that made me pause. The forest grew quieter. The birdsong faded until all I could hear was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Even that seemed subdued, like the trees were holding their breath. Then the trail itself changed. It became narrower, overgrown in places. At first, I thought I'd made a wrong turn, but when I checked the map, I was still on course. I told myself it was just an old trail, not as popular as others I'd been on. That's why it wasn't as well maintained. I pressed on, though a feeling of unease had settled in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. But the further I went, the stronger it grew. About 3 hours in, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A shoe, lying in the middle of the trail. It was a hiking boot, worn and scuffed, but still in decent condition. It didn't look like it had been there long. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. There was no other sign of anyone nearby. No footprints, no rustling in the bushes. Just the shoe, sitting there like it had been placed on the trail deliberately. I thought about turning back then. Something about that shoe felt wrong, like a warning. But I was already more than halfway through the loop. Turning back would take just as long as finishing the trail, and I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared. So I kept going. The trail grew steeper after that, winding up a hill. The trees were denser here, their branches intertwining to block out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, almost damp. And then I smelled it, a faint, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but as I climbed higher, it grew stronger. I told myself it was just a dead animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The smell was too strong, too pervasive. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. When I reached the top of the hill, I saw the source. There was a clearing maybe 20 feet across with a large tree in the center. At the base of the tree was a pile of something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. Just a mass of dark shapes jumbled together. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. And then I realized what I was looking at. It was a pile of animal carcasses. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, anything that lived in the forest. Their bodies were mangled, torn apart like they'd been attacked by something much larger. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I heard it, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted down the trail, not caring about the noise I was making. My only thought was to get away. The footsteps followed me, faster now, crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't look back, couldn't. If I saw whatever was chasing me, I was sure I'd freeze. The trail was a blur. Trees whipped past me, branches scratching at my face and arms. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. Finally, I saw it, the parking lot. My car was the only one there, a beacon of safety. I stumbled toward it, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. It was just a shadow, too far away to make out any details. But it was there, watching. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I started the car and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't stop driving until I was home, hours later. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities the next day. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I haven't been hiking since. I always prided myself on being prepared. Over the years, I'd been on countless hiking trips and thought I had encountered almost every situation nature could throw at me. I'd dealt with sudden storms, wildlife encounters, and even a twisted ankle a few miles from the trailhead. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that solo hike in the summer of 2022. I was in the Swiss Alps, not far from Lauterbrunnen, where I'd been living for about a year. The trail I had chosen was one I'd been wanting to conquer for months. A remote path leading up to a glacial lake nestled high in the mountains. It was a 20-kilometer loop with a steep elevation gain, but I felt confident. I packed my usual gear: plenty of water, high-calorie snacks, a first aid kit, a GPS device, and layers for unpredictable mountain weather. The forecast called for clear skies, and I set out early, just as the first light hit the peaks. The morning air was crisp, and the world felt still, as though it hadn't fully woken up yet. My boots crunched on the gravel path, and the rhythm of my steps quickly became meditative. I didn't see anyone else as I made my way higher into the wilderness, and that solitude was exactly what I had been craving. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail wound through dense pine forests, occasionally opening up to breathtaking vistas of jagged peaks and valleys far below. As I gained elevation, the trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcroppings and patches of wildflowers. I stopped for a quick break at a scenic overlook, eating a granola bar while taking in the view. A pair of hawks circled overhead, their cries echoing faintly in the distance. By midday, I was nearing the halfway point, the glacial lake. The trail had become steeper and more rugged, forcing me to slow down. I could hear the distant roar of a waterfall, and the air grew noticeably cooler as I approached the basin. When I finally crested the last rise and saw the lake, I was struck by its beauty. The water was a surreal shade of blue, framed by snow-capped peaks and a field of boulders that looked like they had been scattered by giants. I set my pack down and took a few minutes to absorb the scene, feeling a deep sense of peace. That peace was short-lived. It started with a strange sound, an intermittent clicking noise that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet wilderness. At first, I thought it might be the wind shifting loose rocks or perhaps an insect flitting around my gear. But the sound persisted, and as I scanned the area, I noticed something odd. About 50 meters away, near the edge of the lake, a cluster of rocks looked disturbed. Some of the larger stones appeared to have been moved recently, leaving fresh scars in the earth underneath. My first thought was that an animal had been digging around, maybe a marmot or a fox. But the arrangement of the rocks didn't look random. It looked deliberate, almost like someone had been stacking or repositioning them for a reason. A cold shiver ran down my spine, though I tried to shake it off. This was the wilderness. Strange things happened all the time. Still, I couldn't completely ignore the unease creeping in. I decided to head back earlier than planned. I packed up my gear and retraced my steps toward the trail. The clicking noise had stopped, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound around me. The wind rustling through the grass, the occasional crack of a twig, the distant rush of the waterfall. Everything felt sharper, more immediate. About 10 minutes into the descent, I realized something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same as it had on the way up. At first, I chalked it up to my nerves playing tricks on me. After all, trails can look different depending on the angle and lighting. But as I kept walking, the feeling of wrongness grew. Landmarks I remembered seeing earlier weren't where I expected them to be. Instead, I kept passing rock formations and tree clusters that didn't match my mental map. I pulled out my GPS device, but to my frustration, it wasn't picking up a signal. That wasn't entirely surprising in such a remote area, but it was still unsettling. My paper map wasn't much help either, as the trail was too faint and poorly marked to follow precisely. I decided to keep going, reasoning that I'd eventually hit a more recognizable section of the path. That was when I saw the boot print. It was fresh, pressed into a patch of damp soil, and it definitely wasn't mine. The tread pattern was different, and the size looked larger. My heart raced as I stared at it. I hadn't seen another person all day, and there were no cars parked at the trailhead when I arrived. Who else could be out here? I stood there for a long moment, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to call out to see if anyone would respond. But the other part, the part driven by a primal sense of self-preservation, told me to stay silent and keep moving. I decided on the latter, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run. I didn't want to panic and make a mistake, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The trail became steeper and more difficult to navigate. Loose rocks shifted under my feet, and I had to grab onto branches to steady myself. My legs were burning, and my breaths came in short, sharp bursts. Every so often, I stopped to listen, straining to hear anything unusual. Once, I thought I caught the faint sound of movement behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. By the time I reached a flatter section of the trail, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I knew I needed to find my way out before dark, but I was no closer to recognizing my surroundings. Worse, my water supply was running low, and I hadn't seen a stream since leaving the lake. I kept walking, fighting the urge to sit down and rest. My body was exhausted, but my mind was racing, cycling through worst-case scenarios. What if I was going in circles? What if I couldn't find the trailhead before nightfall? What if I froze? Ahead of me on the trail was another boot print. This one was even fresher, the edges still moist from the damp soil. And it was facing the opposite direction, as if someone had walked past me going the other way. A wave of cold terror washed over me. I hadn't seen or heard anyone pass me, and there was no other trail nearby they could have come from. Whoever had left that print had been close. Too close. I didn't wait to think it through. Adrenaline kicked in, and I started moving faster, practically jogging down the trail. My pack felt heavier with every step, and my knees ached from the strain. The forest around me grew darker, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I passed. Every sound, a bird call, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, like the woods themselves were alive and watching. Finally, just as the last light was fading, I saw it, the trailhead parking lot. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled onto the gravel and saw my car parked exactly where I'd left it. But my relief was short-lived. As I reached for my keys, I noticed something on the hood of the car. It was a single rock, about the size of a fist, placed squarely in the center. It looked exactly like the rocks I'd seen disturbed near the lake. My hands shook as I unlocked the car and climbed inside, locking the doors behind me. I didn't wait to analyze what it meant or who might have left it. I started the engine and drove away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was miles down the road. I still don't know who or what was out there with me that day. I've thought about it countless times, trying to piece together the details and make sense of it all. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe someone was trying to scare me. Either way, it worked. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I decided to hike the Wildwood Trail on a Saturday in late October. The weather was crisp and cool, with just enough cloud cover to make everything feel damp and muted. I was looking for solitude and a chance to clear my mind, so I went alone. The trail wasn't far from where I lived, but it was one of those routes that didn't get much foot traffic because of its remoteness. Perfect for what I wanted. I had been hiking for years, so I didn't think twice about going solo. I packed the essentials: water, snacks, a map, my compass, a first aid kit, and a lightweight rain jacket. My phone was fully charged, and I had a portable charger just in case. The trail was marked as intermediate, nothing I hadn't handled before. When I arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. That should have been my first clue that maybe today wasn't the best day to be out here, but I brushed it off. It was early, and the overcast sky probably kept people home. I laced up my boots, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail began with a gentle incline through a forest of towering pines and firs. The air smelled earthy and clean, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound around me. For the first hour, I felt completely at peace. The trail was well marked, and I made good time, stopping occasionally to take in the scenery or drink some water. Around mid-morning, the trail started to climb more steeply. The trees grew denser, and the sunlight that managed to filter through earlier was almost completely blocked out. It wasn't dark, but the dimness made it hard to get a sense of direction. I pulled out my map and compass to double-check that I was on the right path. Everything seemed fine. After another hour of hiking, I came to a fork in the trail. The map showed the main path continuing to the left, but there was an unmarked trail to the right. It looked less traveled, with overgrown shrubs and fallen branches blocking parts of it. I considered exploring it for a moment, but decided against it. Sticking to the marked trail was the safer option, especially alone. As I continued, the terrain grew rougher. The path narrowed, with sharp drops on one side and steep inclines on the other. Loose rocks slid under my boots, making each step careful and deliberate. I focused on my footing, not wanting to risk a twisted ankle out here. Then, I noticed something strange. The markers on the trees, which had been consistent up until now, were suddenly nowhere to be seen. I stopped and scanned the area, but there were no signs of the trail ahead. I turned around to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. It hit me I was off the main trail. I felt a small jolt of panic, but quickly shoved it down. Getting lost happens, I told myself. That's why I had the map and compass. I pulled them out again, trying to orient myself, but the dense trees made it hard to pinpoint my exact location. The map didn't match what I was seeing. Maybe I had missed a turn earlier without realizing it. I decided to backtrack. I marked trees with bits of biodegradable tape from my pack, leaving a breadcrumb trail in case I ended up looping around. My pace quickened as the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew. The air felt colder now, and the overcast sky seemed darker. I hadn't seen another person all day, and the silence pressed down on me. After about an hour of walking, I realized I wasn't heading back toward the trailhead. If anything, I was deeper into the forest. My water bottle was half empty, and my stomach growled. I sat down on a fallen log to regroup. I knew the basics of survival: stay calm, conserve energy, and make a plan, but the isolation was starting to get to me. I decided to climb higher, hoping to get a better view of my surroundings. The incline was brutal, with loose dirt and tangled roots making the climb slow and exhausting. When I finally reached a small clearing at the top, I could see for miles, but the view wasn't encouraging. It was just endless forest, with no sign of a trail or landmark. By now, it was late afternoon, and the light was fading fast. The realization hit me hard. I would have to spend the night out here. My jacket and first aid kit had some emergency supplies, but I hadn't planned for an overnight trip. I found a spot that seemed relatively safe, flat ground surrounded by thick trees to block the wind, and started gathering dry leaves and branches for insulation. The night was long and cold. I wrapped myself in my jacket, shivering as the temperature dropped. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness: the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. I kept imagining animals lurking nearby, but I knew the bigger threat was hypothermia. Sleep came in brief, restless stretches, and I woke up sore and stiff when the sun finally rose. I wasted no time packing up and trying to find my way back. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I rationed the last of my water and chewed on a granola bar, but it wasn't enough to stave off the hunger. The forest felt endless, and every direction looked the same. Around midday, I stumbled across something that gave me hope: a small stream. I filled my water bottle and used a filter straw to drink. The cold water revived me enough to keep moving. I decided to follow the stream downhill, figuring it might lead to a larger body of water or even civilization. Hours passed, and the stream grew wider. The terrain became less steep, and I started to hear the distant hum of what I thought might be a road. My heart raced as I pushed forward, the sound growing louder with each step. Finally, I broke through the trees and onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me as I saw a car parked not far away. The driver was a hunter who had been scouting the area. He gave me a ride back to the trailhead, where my car was still parked. I thanked him profusely, my voice cracking from exhaustion and gratitude. When I got home, I collapsed onto my couch, still processing the experience. The hike had been terrifying, but it taught me a valuable lesson. No matter how experienced you are, nature is unpredictable. From then on, I never hiked alone without letting someone know my exact route and expected return time. It wasn't worth the risk. I'd always prided myself on being an experienced hiker. Growing up in Vermont, where nature was practically my backyard, I'd spent countless weekends navigating wooded trails, craggy outcrops, and secluded valleys. Moving to Switzerland only deepened that love for the outdoors, with its towering peaks and pristine forests. But even after years of trekking, I never anticipated how wrong things could go when overconfidence meets the unpredictable power of nature. It was late autumn when I set out on what I thought would be a straightforward solo hike. I had recently heard about an isolated trail that wound through a lesser-known section of the Alps. Locals rarely used it, they said, because it was uneventful. That sounded perfect to me. No crowds, no noise, just me and the wilderness. The weather forecast was clear, though the days had been growing shorter. I had everything I needed: layers of warm clothing, plenty of water, a first aid kit, snacks, a flashlight, and a fully charged phone with an offline map app. My backpack felt heavy but manageable. I left the trailhead mid-morning, expecting to be back before dark. The first few hours were uneventful as expected. The trail meandered through dense pine forests, where the sunlight filtered through the branches in golden streaks. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. Occasionally, I spotted deer tracks or heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. About 4 miles in, the path began to climb sharply. The incline was challenging but exhilarating, and the views opened up as I gained elevation. I could see the snow-dusted peaks in the distance and the patchwork of forests and meadows below. This was why I hiked, for moments like these, where everything felt expansive and serene. By mid-afternoon, I reached a high ridge that the map marked as the halfway point of the loop. There was a flat area with a large boulder where I stopped to eat. The wind had picked up, and I added an extra layer to stay warm. I snapped a few photos of the valley below and checked my phone. No signal, not surprising this deep in the mountains. After resting for about 20 minutes, I decided to continue. I wanted to finish the loop before dusk, and I knew I still had a few hours of walking ahead. The descent on the other side of the ridge was steeper and rockier. The trail narrowed, and the trees became sparser. I had to focus on my footing, as loose gravel made it easy to slip. It was around this time that I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, colder. A layer of fog was creeping in, not uncommon in the mountains but still unsettling. It muffled the sounds of the forest, making everything eerily quiet. I picked up my pace, but the fog thickened quickly. Within minutes, visibility was down to a few feet. The trail, once clear and well-marked, became harder to follow. I took out my phone to check the offline map, but the GPS struggled to pinpoint my location. I felt a flicker of unease. Pressing forward, I tried to stay calm. The trail had to lead somewhere, and I was still confident I was heading in the right direction. But the fog played tricks on my eyes. Shapes loomed in the whiteness, only to dissolve as I got closer. I began to second-guess every turn, every step. Then came the sound. At first, I thought it was just my boots crunching on the gravel or the wind stirring the trees. But it wasn't. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned, peering into the fog. Nothing, just the swirling grayness and the faint outline of trees. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the sound had stopped. Shaking it off as paranoia, I continued walking, a little faster now. The footsteps started again. This time, they matched my pace. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they did too. My heart began to race. I told myself it was an echo or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the fog. There was no response, only the persistent sound of those phantom steps. I don't know how long this went on. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. The fog seemed to thicken further, and the light was fading fast. Panic set in. My logical brain told me to stay calm, to focus on finding the trail markers, but another part of me wanted to run. Then I tripped. A root or a rock. I didn't see it in the fog. I fell hard, scraping my palms and knees. My flashlight skittered out of my hand and landed a few feet away. For a moment, I just lay there, winded and shaken. When I reached for the flashlight, My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a rusted tin can, half buried in the dirt. That's when I noticed the ground around me wasn't just dirt. It was littered with scraps of fabric, broken glass, and what looked like the remains of an old campfire. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here maybe years ago, but why had they left such a mess? And why hadn't I noticed it before? I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my legs trembling. The footsteps had stopped again, but I no longer felt alone. The air was oppressive, heavy with an unshakable sense of being watched. I decided then and there to abandon the loop and backtrack the way I came. Better to retrace my steps than risk getting completely lost. But the fog made everything look unfamiliar. The trail markers were scarce, and I couldn't tell if I was heading the right way. The sound of footsteps returned, louder this time. They weren't behind me anymore. They were to my left, then my right, circling me. I broke into a run, not caring about the rocks or the uneven ground. My only thought was to get out of there. Branches snagged at my jacket, and the fog seemed to close in tighter, but I kept going. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned with the effort. I slipped and stumbled repeatedly, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow through the fog. Headlights, car on the road near the trailhead. I sprinted toward the light, bursting out of the trees and onto the gravel parking lot. The driver was an older man, loading gear into his truck. He looked startled as I came crashing out of the woods, covered in dirt and leaves, and gasping for air. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't stop to explain. I just got into my car, locked the doors, and drove. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of my apartment, that I finally let myself process what had happened. I never figured out what or who was out there in the fog with me. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found nothing unusual when they checked the trail. I haven't been back to that part of the mountains since. What stays with me the most isn't the fear I felt in the moment, but the knowledge of how quickly things can go wrong, even for an experienced hiker. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. And sometimes it holds secrets we're better off not uncovering. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It wasn't anything overly ambitious. A 15-mile loop through a national forest I'd never visited before. The trail was called Ridge Trail, and it was supposed to have amazing views of the valleys below, especially in late autumn when the leaves were a mix of red, orange, and yellow. I'd read reviews online, studied the map, and even packed extra supplies just to be cautious. Edie always loved hiking solo. There was something calming about being alone in nature. It was the middle of October, so the weather was cool and crisp. I packed my backpack with the usual: snacks, a couple of bottles of water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a lightweight jacket. I even brought along a small survival knife, though I'd never had to use it. I arrived at the trailhead just after sunrise. The parking lot was empty, which I liked. It meant I'd have the trail to myself. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and the forest around me was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. The trail started off easy, with a gentle incline and well-marked signs. The trees towered above me, their leaves glowing golden in the morning light. I felt good, strong even, as I made my way up the trail. The first few miles were uneventful, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. About an hour in, the trail started to climb more steeply. The terrain grew rockier, and the trees thinned out, giving me my first glimpse of the valley below. It was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in a patchwork of fall colors, with a river winding through the middle. I stopped to take a photo, though the camera on my phone didn't do it justice. As I continued, the trail became less defined. The path narrowed, and fallen leaves covered parts of it, making it harder to follow. I had to rely on the small trail markers nailed to the trees every few hundred feet. It wasn't a big deal at first, but I noticed the markers were spaced farther apart the higher I climbed. After another mile or so, I reached a fork in the trail. According to the map, the left path looped back toward the trailhead, while the right path led to a ridge with the best views. I decided to take the ridge path. It was still early, and I had plenty of daylight left. The ridge trail was narrower and rockier than the main trail. On one side, there was a steep drop-off, and on the other, a wall of jagged rocks. I moved carefully, making sure to watch my footing. The wind had picked up, too, and it howled as it rushed through the narrow gaps in the rocks. After about half a mile, I noticed something strange. The trail markers had disappeared. I stopped and looked around, but I couldn't see any signs or markers ahead. I turned back the way I'd come, but there were no markers behind me either. I must have missed one. I decided to keep going. The trail was still visible, though faint, and I figured it would lead me back to the main loop eventually. The ridge wasn't very wide, and there was only one way forward. I told myself it would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The farther I went, the rougher the trail became. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree that blocked the path. The wind was relentless now, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I stopped to check my phone for the time. It was just afternoon, but I noticed I didn't have any signal. That wasn't unusual in the mountains, but it added to my growing unease. Then I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, maybe a day old, and they were heading in the same direction I was. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or worried. On one hand, it meant someone else had been here recently. On the other hand, it meant I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I kept going, following the footprints. The trail was almost non-existent now, more of a faint line through the rocks and leaves. The ridge had narrowed to the point where there was barely enough room to walk without worrying about slipping. I had to stop several times to steady myself against the gusts of wind. Finally, I reached the end of the ridge. The view was incredible, even better than I'd imagined. I could see for miles in every direction. Valleys, rivers, and distant mountains all bathed in the golden light of early afternoon. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like I was on top of the world. But then I noticed something odd. There was no trail leading back down. I looked around, hoping to find a marker or some sign of the path, but there was nothing, just rocks and trees and the steep drop-off on either side. I tried retracing my steps, but the wind had blown leaves over the trail, and the footprints I'd been following were gone. I felt a knot of panic tighten in my chest. I was lost. I told myself to stay calm. I still had supplies, and it wasn't like I was stranded in the wilderness. I had a map and a compass, though I hadn't used a compass in years. I sat down and tried to figure out where I was, but the ridge wasn't marked on the map. It was just a blank space between two lines of the main trail. I decided to head back the way I'd come, hoping to find the trail markers again. But the farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The terrain all looked the same: rocks, trees, and the steep drop-off. I couldn't tell if I was going the right way or not. The sun was lower in the sky now, and the shadows were growing longer. I checked my phone again, but the battery was almost dead. I turned it off to save power, just in case. I kept walking, but every step felt like I was getting farther from where I needed to be. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily silent. I didn't even hear birds anymore, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. That's when I saw it. A small, makeshift campsite tucked into a clearing. There was a fire pit made of rocks, though it looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A tattered tarp hung between two trees, and there were a few empty cans scattered around. It didn't look like anyone was there, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I decided not to stop. Something about the campsite felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I picked up my pace, trying to put as much distance between me and that clearing as possible. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I still hadn't found the trail. The forest was growing darker by the minute, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. I found a flat spot under a large tree and unrolled my sleeping bag. I didn't bother with a fire. I was too tired and uneasy to gather wood. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made my heart race. I kept my knife close, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the edge of my vision. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started walking again. My legs were sore, and my throat was dry. I'd used up most of my water the day before. I knew I needed to find the trail soon or I'd be in serious trouble. After hours of wandering, I finally spotted something in the distance. A break in the trees that looked like a trailhead. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding with relief. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't a trail at all. It was a dirt road. I followed the road for what felt like miles, my feet aching with every step. Finally, I saw a car parked at the edge of a clearing. There was a man loading firewood into the back. He looked surprised to see me, but I didn't care. I asked him for help, and he drove me back to the trailhead where I'd started the day before. When I finally got back to my car, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. I'd never been so relieved to be off a trail. The forest had always felt like a place of peace to me, but now it felt different. It felt like a place that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I haven't been hiking since. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Growing up surrounded by forests, mountains, and rivers in Vermont, hiking became second nature to me. After moving to Switzerland, I couldn't resist the lure of the Alps. The sheer scale and rugged beauty of the mountains here dwarfed anything I'd known back home. One weekend, I decided to tackle a less traveled trail I'd read about online. It wasn't one of the popular routes. In fact, I struggled to find much information about it. The hike led into a remote valley called Tiefental, which translated to Deep Valley. It was supposed to be quiet, isolated, and breathtakingly beautiful, a perfect day away from the bustle of daily life. The morning of the hike was crisp and clear. I packed my essentials: water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and an extra layer of clothing. I also carried a GPS device and a printed map, as I knew cell service could be unreliable in the mountains. By mid-morning, I arrived at the trailhead. There was only one other car parked there, and it looked like it had been there for a while. The idea of solitude excited me. I relished the thought of having the trail all to myself. The first part of the hike was idyllic. The trail meandered through dense pine forests, where the air was heavy with the scent of resin and damp earth. Every so often, I'd hear the distant sound of a stream or the rustling of animals in the underbrush. I felt completely at peace. About an hour in, the trail began to climb steeply. As I ascended, the trees thinned, revealing sweeping views of the valley below. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their tops dusted with snow despite the season. I stopped to take in the view and realized how alone I was. It was a strange but exhilarating feeling. As I continued, the trail became rougher. Rocks jutted out at odd angles, and the ground was uneven, forcing me to watch every step. I reached a point where the path narrowed, hugging the side of a steep slope. To my left was a sheer drop into the valley below. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. About 3 hours into the hike, I reached a plateau. The landscape was stunning. Fields of wildflowers stretched out before me, with patches of snow clinging to the shadows of large boulders. A small stream cut through the middle, its water so clear I could see every pebble on the bottom. I refilled my water bottle and sat down for a quick snack. It was then that I noticed something odd. Across the stream, on the far edge of the plateau, there was a patch of grass that had been trampled. It wasn't the kind of disturbance a deer or other animal might make. It looked deliberate, like someone had set up camp there recently. But there were no tents or gear in sight, just the flattened grass. I brushed it off and continued on. The trail led downhill now into a dense forest. The light dimmed as the trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. Felt cooler here, and the air was damp. I noticed the sound of birds had disappeared, replaced by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. As I descended deeper into the valley, the trail became harder to follow. Fallen branches and patches of overgrown vegetation obscured the path in places, and I had to rely on my GPS to stay on course. I found myself stopping frequently to double-check my position, each pause lengthening the journey. After another hour of hiking, I reached a clearing. The forest opened up to reveal a small cabin. It looked old, with weathered wooden walls and a roof that sagged in the middle. Smoke drifted lazily from a crooked chimney, indicating someone was inside. I hesitated. The cabin wasn't marked on my map, and I hadn't expected to find any signs of habitation in this remote area. Something about it felt off. It was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to keep moving. The trail skirted the edge of the clearing, and I quickened my pace, eager to put some distance between myself and the cabin. As I passed, I glanced over my shoulder and thought I saw movement in one of the windows. Couldn't be sure. The trail became increasingly difficult to navigate. Large rocks and fallen trees blocked the path, forcing me to climb over or find a way around them. I was starting to feel the strain in my legs, and the sense of unease that had begun at the cabin hadn't left me. About half an hour later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I stopped and consulted my GPS. To my dismay, I discovered I was no longer on the trail. Somehow I'd veered off course. Panic threatened to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I backtracked, scanning the ground for any sign of the path. The forest looked the same in every direction, and it wasn't long before I realized I was completely lost. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I decided to head uphill, hoping to reach higher ground where I might be able to see a landmark or pick up a signal on my phone. The climb was grueling, and the dense underbrush tore at my clothes and scratched my skin. When I finally reached the top of a ridge, I was dismayed to find that the view offered no clarity. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, with no sign of the trail or the plateau I'd passed earlier. My phone showed no signal and the battery was running low. As the light began to fade, I knew I needed to find shelter. I didn't want to risk wandering in the dark and injuring myself. I found a small overhang beneath a large boulder and decided to hunker down for the night. I gathered some dry leaves and branches to make a small fire, hoping the warmth and light would keep any animals away. The night was long and unnerving. Every rustle in the darkness set my nerves on edge. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. At first light, I packed up and started walking again, trying to maintain a sense of direction. My water supply was running low, and I hadn't eaten much since the day before. My legs felt heavy, and every step was a struggle. By mid-morning, I stumbled upon another trail. Relief washed over me as I followed it downhill, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. After an hour, I emerged from the forest onto a gravel road. A sense of triumph filled me as I spotted a small parking area a short distance ahead. When I reached it, I saw the same car I'd noticed at the trailhead the day before. It was covered in dust, and there was no sign of its owner. I I didn't linger. I followed the road until I came across a farmhouse, where I was able to get directions and call for help. It wasn't until later, when I spoke to local authorities, that I learned about the hiker who had gone missing in Tiefenthal a year earlier. His car was still at the trailhead when I parked there, and no one had seen him since. The memory of the cabin and the trampled grass came flooding back. I'll never know if they were connected to the disappearance, but one thing is certain. I'll think twice before venturing into unknown territory alone again. I've always loved hiking. It's one of those things that feels both adventurous and calming. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere, with only the sounds of the forest around you, that makes you feel alive. That's probably why I decided to plan a solo trip to explore a relatively unknown trail I'd read about online. The trail was tucked away in the middle of a dense forest about an hour's drive from my apartment. It wasn't a popular spot, but that was part of the appeal. The day I set out, the sky was a pale blue, and the air had that crisp coolness you only get in early autumn. Leaves were just starting to turn orange and red, carpeting parts of the forest floor in bursts of color. I packed light, a small backpack with some water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone. I had also downloaded an offline map of the area, just in case I lost reception. The trail started off easy. It was well-trodden with a soft layer of dirt that made for smooth walking. I could hear birds chirping somewhere above me and the occasional rustling of squirrels darting through the undergrowth. Every so often, I'd stop to admire the scenery or take a picture of a particularly beautiful tree or cluster of mushrooms. About an hour into the hike, I reached a fork in the trail. The map showed that both paths eventually led back to the same main loop, but the one to the left was longer and less direct. I decided to take it, figuring I had plenty of daylight left. The further I went, the narrower and rougher the path became. It was clear that fewer people came this way, but I didn't mind. About 30 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. That's when I noticed the uneasy feeling creeping in. The forest around me had grown denser, and the sounds of birds had mostly faded away. All I could hear now was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and my own footsteps crunching on the ground. I stopped to check my map. According to the GPS dot, I was still on the trail or close enough to it. But the path in front of me didn't look much like a trail anymore. It was overgrown, with tall grass and vines creeping across the ground. I figured I must have veered off the main path somewhere without realizing it. I turned around to retrace my steps, but after a few minutes of walking, everything started to look the same. Panic began to bubble in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Getting worked up wouldn't help. I took a deep breath and kept walking, scanning the trees for any signs of the trail. That's when I noticed something odd. A tree with a thick black mark on its trunk. It looked like someone had smeared it with charcoal or paint, though I couldn't imagine why. I decided to use the marked tree as a landmark. If I couldn't find my way back, I could at least return to this spot and try a different direction. With that thought in mind, I continued moving, trying to keep track of my surroundings. But the deeper I went, the more unsettling the forest became. The undergrowth grew thicker, clawing at my legs, and the ground started to slope downward in a way that made me feel like I was being pulled deeper into some kind of pit. I started noticing other strange things too. Branches snapped cleanly in half as though someone had deliberately broken them, rocks arranged in small piles, and more of those black marks on trees. By now, I was fighting the urge to run. I wasn't just lost. I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a faint sound, branches cracking or leaves rustling. But when I stopped to listen, it would go quiet. I kept walking, my breath shallow and my heart pounding. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a structure, if you could call it that. It looked like someone had tried to build a shelter out of sticks and branches. The walls were haphazardly lashed together, and the roof was barely more than a few long logs draped with moss and leaves. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't seem to look away. Something about the shelter felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I took a step back, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger the longer I stood there. A sickly, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. I turned and bolted, not caring anymore which direction I was going as long as it was away from that place. My feet slipped on the uneven ground, and I nearly fell several times, but I didn't stop. When I finally slowed down, gasping for air, I realized the sun had sunk lower in the sky. Shadows stretched long and thin across the forest floor, and the air had grown noticeably cooler. I knew I needed to find my way out soon or risk being stuck out here after dark. I checked my phone, but the battery was almost dead, and the GPS signal was spotty at best. I tried to call for help, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I realized just how alone I was. I pressed on, my legs aching and my throat dry. Every noise in the forest now sounded like a threat. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. It all sent my heart racing. I thought about the shelter and the smell and couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first person to get lost here. Then I saw it, another trail marker. It was old and weathered, but it was definitely a marker. Relief flooded through me, and I followed the path it marked with renewed determination. The trail eventually led me to a small stream. I drank some of the water and washed my face, the cold liquid shocking my system and helping me think more clearly. Following the stream seemed like my best bet. Water usually leads to civilization, or at least to a larger body of water where I might find help. I walked for what felt like hours, my body running on pure adrenaline. Just as the last light of day was fading, I spotted something through the trees, a road. It was a narrow, gravel road, but it was enough to give me hope. I stumbled onto the road and collapsed, my legs too shaky to carry me any further. A few minutes later, headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, and the car slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man in a pickup truck, asked if I was okay and offered to drive me to the nearest town. I didn't have the energy to explain what had happened. I just nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove, I looked back at the forest. The trees loomed dark and menacing in the rearview mirror, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me. I haven't been hiking since that day. The memory of those black marks, the shelter, and the smell still haunt me. I don't know what I stumbled into out there, and I don't think I ever want to find out. All I know is that I was lucky to get out alive.